I'm personally very impressed at how we've been brought both the theoretical and the practical and been introduced into the project already so well. Has anybody got any questions? Can you hear me? Has anybody got any questions they'd like to ask?
I just think it's also wonderful, and it's not so much questions, it's just that in between speakers, when people got talking, all of the what would you call them, addresses, the speeches seem to sort of cause communication. So that's just not a question, just a thank you and an observation, which I think rather works with what was being said anyway. And so sort of listening became also a sort of prompt to be able to exchange. I don't know. But I haven't got a question. Oh, I've got lots of questions. But
I have a question, actually. I have a question for Ben, actually, which is, what do you think the problems of censorship would be in these open spaces in camps?
Sorry, what is the question?
Oh, sorry. What would the censorship problems be in these open... Let's say we set up some blogs, and because I think that actually would be quite feasible. It's not expensive. So if we set up some blog spaces and some channels and so forth, what would how much danger would there be for the people?
It's hard to say. I also should qualify, I'm not an evangelist for technology at all, but I think definitely people need to come together physically. And certainly in Dabbagh, they would love a space where they could come together physically and tell stories or do whatever they wanted to do. But the important thing being that they had a space. The space is the first thing. What fills it is a secondary question over which outside participants should have less influence. But the censorship would take many forms and come from many different directions. You might have censorship from the UN and the agencies who don't want criticism of their developmental business. You also have societal pressures, certainly in a place like Dabbagh, from the conservative mullahs, the religious extremists who don't want particular kinds of stories and expression to happen. At the very basic level, there are codes of dress about how men and women should dress in public and how they can even interact in public. So the traditional sort of clan-based Somali spaces are male-dominated, and they have a particular code and so on. One of the interesting things about the camp is that that's changing. So you have the young woman, Muna, I mentioned earlier, who felt she could go and fall in love with a Sudanese man and reject the clan. So there are good things emerging from the refugee camp as a sort of wider arena, but you are still going to have to contend with different pressures on whatever spaces there exist. So yes, that is an issue, but it's something that the refugees themselves will work out. And where I would look for leadership there is in the young generation in the camp itself who have grown up there. So one of the people in my book is a young man called Tawane who grew up in the camp, is now a youth leader, and they have their own youth club, which, yes, they all still say very nice things about the aid agencies because they're the ones who built the building and provide the internet connection, so they feel there's self-censorship in the sense they feel constrained there. But within that space, they all rhetorically reject the clan, they reject the religious extremism. It's very much a space founded on democracy and respect and so on, even though he then went back to his house and supervised the circumcision of his daughter. Nonetheless, in this space here, he was very much a bastion for all of the good things which allowed people to come together. So there's lots of different pressures at play.
Yes, because one of the great difficulties about communal storytelling is that it can be reinforcing of the dominant group rather than the channel for evolving a new way. I mean, what you were talking about, evolving a new... And of course, you know, we need to leave it to them. They have to form their own channels and groups, and it's not up to us to impose our views. But nevertheless, with sort of myth-making and, you know, fairy tale telling, this is always the danger. The danger is that it, you know, institutes the conventions of the dominant group, which is not the conventions of emancipation usually. Yes. So that's that I don't know how to. I mean, that's a sort of endemic problem. Because the lone voice, when you said that in Nairobi, in the town, they wanted to have secret confiding, that's a need of freedom against the hegemony of the ideology. Yes. Yeah, yes, Liz has a question.
I had a question about those very people in Nairobi who wanted to keep their stories secret. In that situation, from your experience, how would you then create a space in which they would feel confident to tell stories to each other in a public space or a more open space?
I think we're talking about a multiplicity of spaces, aren't we? Really, I mean, the internally displaced people in Congo, yes, they're very much. There is a dominant narrative. There is a single narrative. That is a community of people who rely on each other to survive, and therefore that shared narrative is essential. I think when you get to a refugee camp where there is an infrastructure and you have the possibility to, you have opportunities perhaps to realize your individuality, then yes, you do also resist the group. But I think the example of Tawane in the refugee camp is a good one, where you have a youth center. In this case, the aid agency is Danida. Criticism against the UN in general is sort of frowned upon, but Danida is to be congratulated for providing that space, for responding to the youth group, giving them the money to have their area so that they can do that. And in the slums in Nairobi, there are some community areas where people can get together. There are very active political battles within Kenyan society about who gets to talk and where, and that's politics. So one can intervene in that process, of course. What I thought was interesting was just that the dynamic. That here people wanted to speak in private, whereas in other places they absolutely didn't want to speak in private. They wanted their version, their story to be confirmed by a wider group. I mean, obviously it's fraught with all sorts of the politics of intervention are fraught with all kinds of different pitfalls. That's why I think somebody who is interested in finding out those stories, promoting stories from those communities, and learning the lessons and transmitting those, broadcasting those stories into other spheres, should focus on the space. That's really what I was trying to say.
Thinking about the story of the child that Marina showed with the water collector, and thinking about the spaces that the children move through, which are not quite the same as the bigger institutional spaces. What happens when the children go to collect the water, and how do they communicate? Because in a way they're not aware of some of these wild things. Did you see moments where they were collecting water?
Yes, I mean every day it's a fight. And the fight starts at 5 a.m. because you've got 120 families lining up. They all need water from one tap. And it's the kids that get sent with the big jerry cans. So to some extent, it's Lord of the Flies, and there's big fights that go on often. But in other areas, they sort themselves out. There's an orderly queue. It is in the sort of folklore of the camp. It's the place where you go to flirt. It's the place where you go, where you can rub up against communities that you're otherwise forbidden from socializing with. So boys will go often volunteer to collect the water because it's where you go to meet girls, because you can't do that in the street openly. But if you've got a mission, it's okay. So the water point is definitely a big focus for all sorts of different intrigues. The other thing is school. And school is a pretty neutral space. And it's one of the reasons why Al-Shabaab in Somalia particularly targets primary schools, because it doesn't want kids to have a secular experience and to have a freedom to express themselves. And that's one of the major achievements of the institutionalized refugee camps, is that the kids who have been through that education system have had that opportunity and that experience in school.
With the water carriers, who provides things that carry the water?
Well, in the Dadaab camp, it all comes from the ground. It's boreholes. In Doloado, I think it's trucked. So it's big water trucks coming in. And then in other places, you fill up these huge sim tanks. But an interesting detail, in Dadaab, each block has its own tap, and the tap has a fence around it with a padlock, so that only people from that block can, even though all the water comes out of the ground, it's very highly regimented who can actually...
How does it get, when it goes from the tap to the pens, to people with their own containers?
Yeah, they have a 5-gallon jerry can.
So how do they get that?
The jerry can comes from the UN. So you get a ration card, you get a tent, you get a blanket, and you get 1,650 calories a day from the World Food
So say, for example, Stories in Transit wanted to make a leap into the water container. Is that theoretically possible?
To go and be there?
No, that the water container could be something for Stories in Transit.
Of course, yes.
Yes, it's a very good idea.
You had a question? Yeah.
Yeah, this is a question for David Herd. You showed us these two kind of complexes. One, the very shocking image of the detention camp in Dover, utterly isolated from the things around it. But the Black Mountain College was also quite an isolated structure. And I'm kind of interested in how that sense of separation, you called it a refuge as well, that sense of something apart, can have quite contrasting associations. And I guess, could you reflect a bit on the importance of that sense of a place apart for what happened at Black Mountain? Was that necessary, or could it have happened just as easily in the middle of the city?
It's a really good question. I think Black Mountain thought of itself. I think it thought it was necessary to be apart. I think it felt that something had to be nurtured, and in order for that nurturing to occur, then it had to be at a kind of remove. I suppose this speaks in a complicated way to the question of what it means to transmit one set of stories or ideas from one space to another. I think there's a clear sense there that the work that was being created had to reach a certain kind of maturity in a certain space in order then to be presented to another kind of space. So I think that was important, and I think it was especially important to the poets that was so. And how that, I don't know that I can think about how that speaks to this situation exactly. But I suppose we should observe that that's a voluntary separation, and then the space at the Dover Immigration Removal Centre is plainly not a voluntary. It's not a voluntary separation, and all of the kind of dynamics that might constitute the kind of refuge that Black Mountain wanted to create itself as aren't allowed to operate in that space. There's a kind of it's quite clearly a kind of state of exception at a remove. It's a sort of it's really a kind of non-place, I think. So there's a sort of parallel, but I suppose one is just an inversion or a kind of distortion of the other. I don't know if that starts to answer it at all.
Yeah, I suppose I'm sort of quite interested in trying to glean some more parameters around from people who've been to the camps in terms of the design constraints around a space. I suppose one of the sort of first questions is how often the space you envision it needing to move, because it seems like probably a semi-permanent position has more problems than it sort of moving on a daily basis around. I imagine the site's probably a few miles across. So you sort of want an opportunity, almost like a sort of travelling circus, to arrive on a daily, even want to pitch up each evening in a new place, possibly in a sort of liminal space between two clans. So it gives an opportunity for those people, an excuse for those people to mingle, like the watering hole. But it's sort of it. But from a design point of view, as I'm here with Pete, who I work with as a structural engineer. I'm an artist. But just those sorts of constraints of how many people, how often does it need to move, how quickly do you need to set it up, how many people does it contain, all of those things. What's the budget per space? How many spaces do you need? All those sorts of things, because it all comes into just the constraint. It will rapidly kind of define itself through those constraints once we sort of understand them more, I guess.
I mean, this is a long conversation, but many of the images that Marina was showing about the medieval storytelling, or not even medieval, but the present day inheritors of those traditions, seem to me to be very appropriate certainly in the Dabbagh camp and in many of the other camps in the Horn of Africa. Dabbagh is quite unique because it's been there for 27 years. It's very established. It's not just a few kilometers, it's 50 square miles with 5 different camps and sort of buses between them and so on. It's a sort of conurbation. You have a similar architecture in Chad, with Darfur refugees in Ethiopia and so on. But the kind of traveling circus idea, I think, is fantastic. That sort of people showing up who are catalysts in a way. But perhaps there's several stages. Perhaps you work with people from there who are storytellers who want to have a chance to sing or remember their traditions or perform things which people can engage with, but they've been too busy trying to scratch a living for their family rather than paying attention to their craft. So, for example, one of the most famous singers in Somalia in the 1990s is a refugee in Dabbagh, and she's really well known, but she doesn't sing. She's got 5 children and she collects firewood. So finding those people, giving them an opportunity, giving them a barrow that they can go around with, and just giving them a week off, or bringing in whatever other people or things you want to bring in. But moving around, I think, is a very good idea. Working with finding guides to the locations. So in terms of refugee camps, whether it was Dolowado in Ethiopia or Kakuma in northern Kenya, or this one, or the ones in Uganda, finding people who are guides who can say, well, here or there, and in many places schools are a great location because they're neutral, because they are, if it is an institutionalized camp, those are grounded in UN law, UN doctrine, UN sort of values, if you like. So questions of clan, of conservatism, of sort of the projections of politics from the host, from the original conflict countries of origin, are diluted or contained. There is a value system which promotes independence and freedom and that kind of thing. So I would say guides, schools, and existing artists and storytellers within the communities.
I think what David said about the public space being that the story was created not only by the person telling the story, but by the public space where that story is allowed to take place. And it would take very little, if one could persuade the organizers of camps that this was important, it would take very little very little logistical. It would just mean that they would expect that in the same way as they expect them to give them water. They should think that they give them this space, this permission.
Yeah, very quick question for David Herd, but perhaps it will speak to both papers. I'm very sympathetic and really interesting to hear those connections between the practice at Black Mountain and the ongoing issue of indefinite detention. I'm thought quite a bit about chance procedures and John Cage's work in Black Mountain, how that might function in refugee camps and in places where there is detention by one means or another. So in my work in Palestine, which is the main context that I know, but I've also been involved in Marina's project, I've thought, and have undertaken kind of workshops where chance procedures are kind of at the centre. And I have some sense of what happens when you take kind of the idea of the chance procedure, which emerged, say, in John Cage's work in the 1950s, and you move that into the space of the refugee camp. And it seems to me, the idea of chance in itself becomes politicised by the context. So for a Palestinian, you might not know when your house is going to be bulldozed, or when the water is going to be turned off, or when your family member might come back from prison. So the idea of chance takes on a radically different notion than it might do for, a creative writer experimenting how chance works in their work in a university room in Birkbeck. I haven't thought a great deal about it, other than I'm aware that the notion of chance becomes politicised in a space of a refugee camp. And I was wondering, given that you've thought much more about how Black Mountain as a creative space might be a model for a way of thinking about creative work inside either refugee camps or in spaces of indefinite detention, what your thoughts were about that aspect of Black Mountain's work, and how we might think about that as being something we could use, or I don't know. That's the question.
It's a really interesting question. I should say that what I've thought about is not how these procedures would work in refugee camps, because that's not quite what I've been speaking to. I've been trying to speak to detention and its consequence and post-detention existence. I think you touch on something really important when you say that chance means something almost entirely other in this kind of setting, because so what it speaks to is a kind of precarity. I suppose you could, if you're reading back historically, then you could think that that's what it emerges from. The desire to pursue a chance procedure emerges from an understanding that this is a precarious moment, that something has to speak to that. I suppose what I want to say is that the way chance occurs in the work that I do is that conversations just start up in the walking, and it's not something we've talked about, but the key space in Refugee Tales is not the formal space in which the stories get spoken in the evening, important as that is. The key space is the walking, when all kinds of storytelling and all kinds of communication takes place, all of it unpredictable. So it's not then that there isn't a chance procedure at work because nobody's established a set of rules, but it is a chance procedure because you sort of do know where you're walking, but you don't know where you're walking through, and you don't know who you're going to be in conversation with. And then that becomes a very powerful mechanism for creating a community in that particular moment. And that can't be underestimated and undervalued as an effect, because the kind of what the whole thrust of government policy is to produce social isolation, almost absolute social isolation. So any kind of procedure then which produces the kind of talking that comes out of stories is a valuable procedure, I think. That's not as technical an answer as maybe you're thinking, but
no, it is. It's really useful, and actually hearing that word precarity and thinking about the relationship between precarity and creativity and what that might mean in Palermo particularly, but also my own work in Palestine has really actually clarified a lot for me, because sometimes it's becoming aware of that the kind of precariousness of the situation needs to be understood, but also kind of fed into what then might be the creative act.
And this is it speaks to the situation of storytelling itself. So the situation of storytelling in the UK for a person seeking asylum is absolutely precarious, in the sense that, so when a person arrives, seeks asylum, they will tell their story. And then that story will be the version that they have to cleave to in all of the other tellings. I mean, people will know this, but in all the other circumstances in which they have to tell that story, they will have to cleave to that telling, as if it's possible to do that. Because at any point at which they deviate from the original story, then the Home Office, or whoever's representing the Home Office, can deem that in the first place they weren't telling the truth. And so everything about the utterance of the story, including the space in which it occurs, including the sort of necessary anonymizing at times, including the fear of people who have been detained, who have to report on a weekly or a fortnightly basis that they might be re-detained, everything about the story is precarious. And then the urgency of creating a space in which the story can actually be heard and played with and moved around and circulated in a way that isn't deeply scrutinized, that's a significant thing. Now, I don't know how it speaks to the sort of situation.
Well, I guess one of the routes...
Can I cut you off for a second there,
sure.
Steve?
No,
Sorry.
of course.
I just think there are a couple more questions here. Would you like to go first and then one
I'd
more?
like to ask about materials that have been, in your experience, been either particularly surprisingly useful or particularly surprisingly not useful or particularly valuable in situations, so that when you've gone into a camp, are there some things that you would avoid completely if you were designing something, or are there materials that might have multiple uses afterwards even that could be used again?
Well, I think one of the things that's most surprising about the Dadaab camp and other camps in the Horn of Africa is the way in which everything is recycled. And the same goes for the slums, I think, in the big cities as well. Most of the market in Dadaab, for example, is made out of tins. So oil tins, petrol tins, hammered flat, and then nailed to wood, because it's more secure than corrugated iron, and you can lock it, so you can make doors and lock them. Most other building materials in the camp are wood. The corrugated iron is quite expensive, so you have walls made of mud or thorns lashed together, which people can sort of force a way through. But the thing that is prized for privacy is metal tins. Thorns are everything. Thorns are walls. You can make beds out of them. You can make everything out of thorns. And that's mainly because thorns are the only wood that grows in the desert, and which is why the book's called City of Thorns. But pretty much everything has a retail value. So that's what Marina said about trade really struck home to me, is that most things will have a value to somebody somewhere, and it's important to understand that local economy. Yeah, I mean, there's so many surprising things, but nothing particularly brings to mind to avoid, but just that the gaze of people there of things that you might consider normal, of course, is very interesting and very different. And there's a lot to be said for the gap between the way that we see some things and they see some things.
It's just hard to think about a gingerbread house or something, something edible or dissolvable or something that disappeared back into the ground. It's just sort of hard to place yourself there, to be able to think of something that either imposing itself or perhaps can be then used as something else. But then you might get
well, maybe one very just brief comment, which I thought about in relation to this conversation, is that whenever there's an event, so for example, related to the travelling circus, Film Aid is an organisation that puts up a mobile screen and shows movies in refugee camps. And whenever there's an audience and there's a clear space in front of the screen, you'll find children performing. You'll find kids rolling around doing somersaults, doing dancing, or hilarious stuff, all kinds of interesting different things, just because there is the equivalent of a chalk circle inscribed or on the ground. And anything you put into that, they will utilise. So in a way, it doesn't really, of course it matters, but it doesn't matter so much. It's just that there's something there which they will make something of it, believe me.
We have a time for one question. Sorry, just in front of Marsha. Sorry.
Something that David said and the images that Marina showed. I was interested in the comment you made about language being the barrier at the border in Britain. And when you come out of the border, the next barrier that the refugee has to face is not just language, but the way the language is used, so in other words, accents. And the boxes that you were showing me, and the use of the boxes and the stories that could be told silently through action, so the puppet, and how these two connect seems to me very interesting.
saying about language, did you notice the way accents outside of the detention centre, how that is kind of negotiated by the refugees? Can you see that if you have a received pronunciation and if you have an accent out in the wider world that is away from the university setting, how telling stories within the school playground, how that can have an effect?
Well, yeah, the answer is certainly that it can have an effect. And this goes to a question that I would really like to ask Ben in a way, which is, at what point does a person actually become part of the polis that Ben was describing and that he was referring to Hannah Arendt as talking about? So in a tribunal setting, the function of the person who is the surety is really to be the person who sort of bears the official language. And that person will be a passport holder, and they'll invariably be an upstanding citizen. And really what they're doing is they're vouching for the person who is seeking asylum or is seeking bail from that situation. So it does bear on how the language is articulated. A thing that people who have been detained seek to do very quickly is to get such English tuition as they can. And then I think it would be true to say that for people who have been detained, there is a kind of prizing of a certain kind of English, and obviously what one wants is a space in which all of those, not only all of the various Englishes might get spoken, but all of the various languages get spoken. But this goes to the question of the polis. I'm really interested to know whether in a camp situation, at the point at which a story is being told, then a polis is being formed, or a person is gaining access to it. Because the problem with the idea is that it's sort of circumscribed, isn't it? Some people do have access to the polis, and some people don't. That's exactly what the fight about the language at the border is about. And so the question then is, what's the linguistic thing that has to occur that secures recognition in the polis? I suppose it's not an easy one, but it's quite an important question. Can we finish on this?
Yeah, just like finish on this.
In Dadaab, you have a majority Somali population of about 95%. You also have Ugandans, Congolese, Rwandans, Ethiopians, Sudanese. The youth centre makes a militant point that all communication must be in English, even when there's only one other non-Somali speaker there, Sudanese or Congolese. And that is precisely because everybody must have access to the language to understand. As soon as it slips into Somali, the discourse changes, the frame changes, and the possibility of the potential of that group immediately changes. What Hannah Arendt said about the polis is that it's a transient thing. It exists whenever people get together and speak and act together and see each other as equals. And that might only happen once, but then the power of it is the memory of its potential, that you can access that power again. The legitimacy stems from the original convening of the group. And to the extent that group can be as democratic and even perhaps non-linguistic as possible, whether it's a traveling circus with puppets and there's no words or there's no language, or it's something that all children or whoever can access on an equal footing, then it becomes more universal, thus more powerful.
Okay. I think we'll have to end there. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to the wonderful panel. Thank you. Thank everyone. Thank you.